Welcome. This is a second look roundtable. Today we'll be discussing Ukraine, Russia, and the current invasion and war that's taking place over there. With us, we have experts Richard Harris, who is Professor Emeritus at Rutgers University-Camden campus. He's a PhD in political science and has a master's in Russian history. We have Oleksii Krykunov, who's a PhD in history, specializing in Ukraine, Eastern Europe, and religious studies. He's a Ukrainian national. We have Ilya, who is a Russian national software engineer who emigrated from Russia due to events in 2014. We have Craig Carroll, who is our second look managing editor and former U.S. Defense intelligence analyst with extensive experience in the Pacific Theater. We have Nick Ramos, who's a second look writer. He's working on an article about the historical context of the current Ukrainian-Russian region. And I'm Stacia Wilson, your host for this roundtable. We'd like to get started by hearing Oleksii's story. We're very lucky to have him here with us today. He was in Ukraine until recently. So go ahead and please share your story, Oleksii.
Yes, hello everyone. Basically, I live in Ukraine all the time. And on February 17th, I had a scheduled trip to US, Florida, before the war had started. So I was planning to go and leave in March, come back to Ukraine, and everything just happened when I was here. All of my friends, I would say all of my male friends are enlisting for the territorial defense force right now in Kiev, and not just in Kiev. And of course, it makes me feel like I should be part of it and at least try to help as much as I can right now from where I am and share stories. Basically, the story is horrible, and I did not expect to see something like this in my lifetime, that my city would be bombarded, that it's World War II style sirens going off sometimes 3 times per night, as my friends tell me. And there is a good chance I'm possibly not going to come back to my building, to my apartment. It's pretty intense feeling. And as many people say right now, those who are in the East Coast or in America, and they are really worried about their relatives, their friends in Ukraine, they don't go to sleep until there's sun rising in Ukraine, because this nighttime is very intense. Most of the bombardment happens during the nighttime right now. So basically just reading news, calling them, asking them, because you are just from there, 2 weeks in Ukraine, 2 weeks from Ukraine. So basically the morale is very high as far as I see. The morale is so high that nobody had expected it to be this way. Even some very optimistic people I've known before who were in the Ukrainian military previously, they were saying, yes, we will do everything, but, we don't know. Russia is very strong, but it seems to be that it's not the way it was seen by many. That Russia is not that strong, that many of the things they were showing off before, their new tanks, supposedly, or their new weaponry is simply not there. And they've thrown the best right now, the best of fighting capability troops to Ukraine. And Ukrainians have motivation. Their troops don't understand what they do. Russians, some especially those who are POWs, mostly they say they were planning this training, and suddenly they were sent to Ukraine. Probably lying, but maybe they were not told. 20-year-olds, 22-year-olds. So that's what Putin has, basically children, to send to Ukraine. So their morale is very low, as far as I know from the field. Ukrainians are defending their country. For example, previously there were different political camps. For example, 2 different journalists, pro-Ukrainian, but let's say they had some different opinions from different newspapers. They could be arguing, quarreling before. As soon as war began, quarrels were forgotten. everyone who was against each other as journalists or some politicians, they became really working for the cause of victory. I mean, the self-organization became absolutely strong, and this is impressive. It
It's
started before the war, actually, because it was this sense was growing that it will happen eventually, but still not everyone believed that Putin is so insane right now. But it turned to be true. So yes, everyone, nobody is thinking about giving up at all. It's only about winning in Ukraine. Yeah.
we're glad you're here and safe, and our hearts go out to the people in Ukraine who are fighting right now. um, that's an amazing story. It's amazing timing wise that you ended up taking a trip right then. Um, it must be a
Mhm.
strange feeling
Yes,
to
at
not be able to
some
go
point
home.
I feel like being there. You see, when I
Yeah.
talk to my friends who have enlisted and they're writing to me, I feel like I have to do something. And basically, because I had COVID prior to visiting, and basically, if I caught COVID at least 5 days later, or maybe 4 days later, I might have not be here right now because I wouldn't be able to get the negative test. So it was really by chance. So
Wow.
this is the way it is.
Well, I know the media was hyping up that there was going to be a war, but there was also a lot of people who were skeptical, who were like, there's been a
Hmm.
war ongoing for many years since I think 2014, and so there
Hmm.
was a lot of skepticism as well. So I'd like to get into the history of the region and just help make sense for people. Um, why this is happening, what has been going on. I know a lot of people haven't been, like myself, haven't been following the region, and so this may have come as a surprise to many people. Professor Richard Harris, would you like to speak on your thoughts about what's going on?
Share some initial impressions. So I have to say I'm in the same camp as Oleksii in that I expected some kind of an incursion, but I was truly shocked at the extent and the brutality of this. I was expecting something similar to what happened in Ossetia or in Crimea. And like many people, I was focused on the adjacent region of Donbass, um, and it really put me back. It put me back on my heels to try and assess the situation. I guess I'd say a couple of things. One is I don't know how many people know of the American poet Maya Angelou, but she had a very poignant observation once when someone was talking to her about racists and racism. And she said, I think this is verbatim, when someone tells you who they are, believe them. And I think that Vladimir Putin has been telling us who he is for quite some time. But it's interesting that not everybody really believed him. I mean, I don't know how many people in the audience are old enough or can recall that when Putin first came on the scene as kind of a supporter of Yeltsin, he was not seen as a bad guy. He was seen as a technocrat, somebody who was sane, sort of a stabilizing force. Um, but if you look at what he's been saying for 20 years now, I think it's clear that I guess to put it politely, he had revanchist ambitions for Russia. He's been telling us for a long time that the end of the Soviet Union was a tragedy, not that he wanted to go back to communist style rule, but he certainly had a nationalist gloss on his ambitions for Russia. I think the other thing I was trying to wrap my mind around is why he had such a extensive incursion, and the immediate gloss that a lot of reporters and talking heads on TV have is he's unhinged, he's a madman, and I think that's completely unhelpful. We tend to do that all the time. We did the same thing with Osama bin Laden. He hates freedom, he's a madman. The way I looked at it was he was actually applying an old Soviet analytic framework that's known as correlation of forces. It goes back to the time of the Bolsheviks. And the idea of correlation of forces is you need to assess military, diplomatic, and economic forces that are in play, but not just worldwide, but that has to be done more locally at a regional level. And I'm wondering, I don't know, I'd be a fool to say I did. I'm wondering if he was engaged in some kind of an analysis of the regional correlation of forces and also the problems he was facing at home. And he thought this was an appropriate moment to strike. And I guess the last thing I'd say is there's a lot that's been made about Russia's history with Ukraine and Kiev in particular. I mean, if you wanted to, delve into this, you could go back to the Russian primary chronicles and their origin story that's rooted in Kiev. And I'm sure.
What is that?
So there's in Russian history, there's a source known as the primary chronicles, which is sort of the origin story of the Russian nation, and it's rooted in an old state that is known as Kievan Rus. Was set up originally by Viking invaders, but eventually Slavs. Interesting, I guess the first truly Slavic leader of Kievan Rus was Vladimir the First. I don't know if that's weird in some way, but Russians know this history, and I'm sure that Putin was playing into this when he was trying to describe Ukraine as not an independent nation and historically part of Russia. I think he was tapping into these sort of deep historical understandings for his own craven purposes. So let me step back and give others a chance to weigh in.
Go ahead, Nick.
Sure, yeah. Thank you, Professor Harris. So yeah, one of the difficulties is where do you start the story, right? Because Putin decided to start it in 1917, and he particularly blamed the Bolsheviks and Vladimir Lenin for what he called creating the Ukrainian nation. And there's an element of truth to that, which is that very much the Bolsheviks did bolster Ukrainian nationalism as they needed support from the different republics against their further fight against the whites during the Russian Civil War. But in the course of the 20th century...
The whites?
Yeah, so when in 1917, around World War I, when the Bolsheviks managed to take control in Moscow, they moved the government to Moscow eventually. They get into a civil war, a long struggle against the whites, who are essentially anti-Bolshevik. They're not necessarily supportive of the aristocracy of the old Nicholas aristocracy, but they very much are willing to institute reaction or some sort of military government or something like that. And that's the Russian Civil War, which is the Bolsheviks in several nations against the Russian whites. Eventually, the Russian whites are defeated. Now, in this span from 1917 to 1991, the Ukraine declares independence from Russia 6 different times. 3 times in World War I and twice in World War II. The one that finally takes us in 1991, when Ukraine inherits its territory that it was given as a Russian republic. And part of that territory includes Crimea, which is a usual... Crimea was very close to the old Russian... it was an industrial zone, right? It's on Black Sea. It's a harbor. So it was very close to the Moscow government. It mainly spoke Russian. In fact, Eastern Ukraine mainly speaks Russian. So right away, when Ukraine achieves independence, which is supported. There is a vote on independence, and it is supported overwhelmingly in the Ukraine by 91%. There's already a division in language in between the Ukrainian-speaking West and the Russian-speaking East. They have different outlooks. And interestingly enough, even today, the president, Zelensky, he's not a particularly great Ukrainian speaker. He has to finish sentences in Russian. He struggles with accent, stuff like that. So right away from Ukraine's inception, there's already a cultural divide.
Is that true, Oleksii? Do you agree with that assessment of Zelensky?
Good with the Ukrainian, much better than that.
Sorry,
he's an actor.
say that again.
Well, he's much better than that in Ukrainian right now. And basically, the cultural divide right now disappears very quickly, particularly these days. Because even if Russia had some supporters in Eastern Ukraine right now, they're just... basically, I think there was abruption with...
Oh, I think we lost Oleksii.
So basically,
Oh.
basically, right now, as Russia pounds and attacks Ukraine, all this support, which could, yes, I think there was some abruption. So basically, right now, as Russia attacks Ukraine, even those supporters of Russia, for example, in some eastern regions or southern regions, are changing sides for Ukraine very quickly, and it happens right during these days, very fast. And language doesn't really matter anymore. Actually, it did not matter even 8 years ago, because, for example, first Maidan in revolution to replace the government in 2006-05, and the second in 2014, in Kiev, people who have gathered were mostly Russian-speaking people from Kiev, and they were supporting pro-Ukrainian and pro-European cause of Ukraine. So this language divide is less and less serious, at least in Kiev. That's for sure. And right now, as war goes on, I think Russian-speaking Kharkiv, which is being bombarded with cluster bombs by Putin, all this fades away, even those last pro-Russian sentiments, regardless of language or anything, basically.
Okay, thanks.
I would agree that language is mattering less. I would agree. Where I would disagree is that in 2014, language didn't matter, because one of the first things after the 2014 revolution was, one of the very first things the parliament did was to abolish the 2012 language law. Right?
Mm-hmm. Well, the thing is that this group which was doing it, there were a few deputies, there is a history behind it, were later known to be financed by a pro-Russian oligarch, Medvedchuk. So in many ways, this initiative to quickly create this dissent on the Russian-speaking side was a provocation, most likely. So we were studying this issue, particularly with this law in 2014. But eventually, in eastern or southern Ukraine, especially with the coming up of new generation, language is not an issue anymore. They don't really care. They know both languages fluently.
Gotcha.
So, yeah.
Let's talk about 2014, because that keeps coming up, and I actually wasn't aware of it. Maybe most people were, but let's actually hear from Ilya, who left Russia due to what happened in 2014. Do you want to tell us your experience with 2014, Ilya?
Yeah, so I've been watching events on Maidan very closely, because what I clearly saw there is sort of forming of national character, not along language boundaries, but along something much more deep and important, because historically, Ukrainian mentality, regardless of the language, is much more independent and I would even say anarchic. So Ukrainians do not respect hierarchy as much as Russians do, and that makes them very, very different. So they operate very well in small groups, like community-driven efforts, which is clearly what we see right now. And like this national trait it's not centered around the language or even around ethnicity. It's something around the place itself, and it's hard to tell what exactly is driving what exactly is driving this trait. Maybe the fact that Ukraine was throughout its history mostly agricultural, but this trait is definitely there. You can see it when you communicate with Ukrainians and when you communicate with the Russians. It was clearly seen, and as I myself, I'm sort of a proponent of healthy nationalism, because I think that one of examples of really good governance goes bottom up, like from community-based self-governance and self-administration. And around 2012, 2014, before Maidan started, I've seen something like that as a perspective direction for Russian nationalism too, because although I'm Jewish, I never was before 2014 disloyal to Russia, and I actually wanted to stay there. And I thought that if this sort of grassroots nationalism is taking place, maybe Russia can get out of the authoritarian framework which was imposed on it, and it was imposed on it not by Putin, but many centuries before that. And it's sort of what Putin is doing is sort of historical curse that has been there for centuries. And maybe Richard can add more light to this, because I'm not a historian, but at least that's what I know. So when events at Maidan started, I watched it closely, and I was a huge fan, and I thought that maybe Russia is going to be inspired by this movement and goes in the same direction, and this will improve situation there as well. But then when Maidan happened, government was overthrown, and Putin decided, I don't want to dive deep into his reasons, also we can discuss it separately. Putin decided to annex Crimea and start hybrid war in the east of Ukraine.
So to clarify, Crimea was, so I did a little research, and so Crimea was part of Ukraine,
Yes.
and they found oil, right? No, not
I
in the.
I don't believe in any old stories in Crimea. The reason, at least officially, was different because they considered Sevastopol strategic military base, and they didn't want this military base to go to NATO. So that was like official explanation, sort of. But I don't believe it is bullshit. You know, like it's closed sea with no, and all the countries on the other coast of the sea are already NATO countries. So what's the point? So anyway, it's not important. So after this decision was made and all those events happened, like I had a clear understanding that Russia is done for. Like nothing good has ever happened there until this regime is in force. So people just made absolutely stupid mistake, because if let's see, if you govern Russia and you sort of want to bring the whole Slavic world into your orbit, you don't do this by antagonizing them, right? So let's see, you're Putin and you want to keep Russia in your orbit of influence. So probably the best course of action is to use soft power to influence local elections, which will influence central elections, and get your point across. But if you just annex 3 most pro-Russian regions and exclude them from Ukrainian political process completely, you get exactly the opposite of what you intend to do. So as some smart man said like long time ago, it was worse than a crime, it was a mistake. Even if you look at this from, even if you look at this from a purely imperial perspective and you're Putin, you think that this is your goal, this is just stupid and this serves no purpose. So I came to the conclusion that Russian leadership has completely lost the touch with reality, and it's time to move out. So I'm Jewish, I have a right to return, so I moved to Israel. That's my story.
So, okay. For does anyone disagree with that? Does anyone have any comments? I personally, I would like more explanation of what happened. So Putin annexed Crimea, which was part of Ukraine, as well as a couple other sections. Go ahead, Oleksii.
Yeah, I would like to say about the mentality issue, the differences with mentality. Basically, even those, especially since 2014, those even pro-Russian people that lived in Ukraine, whether they were ethnically Ukrainian or Russian, they were still always very different from, let's say, Russians from Russia. Always. Even if they were trying to say something, against, let's say, United States and America, or saying something against all of this, against Ukraine, still they became very much used to a lot of freedom of speech, freedom of press, something they don't have in Russia. So basically, and this is pretty strong argument, as it always was, saying, all right, you are used to complain about things in Ukraine, and you can do it. You can post your messages on Facebook without being threatened politically. You can basically criticize anyone. You can call President Poroshenko or now Zelensky anything, and nothing happened to these people, basically. Just residents, just people. Or they can complain about central heating, and they just can have demonstration and nobody arrests them and so on. In Russia, everything is controlled. You don't just say something like that, basically. And we have seen it in Crimea a few times, especially in the mentioned city of Sebastopol, I think in 2016, when people came out to complain about the pipes, central heating problem, something broke, and they began to have this little meeting on the street. They got arrested by the special force very quickly. And just because you don't do this in Russia, Russia is very different. So even the pro-Russian people in Ukraine, without even understanding that, became basically part of more democracy, which Ukraine began to allow them. And it became very vivid in Crimea many times, when they couldn't understand what's going on. Something, this great life will come, and it didn't. So basically, they were watching Russian television prior to 2014. They thought Russia is better, but it's not. So Ukrainian mentality, to be more clear, it's not just more freedom-liking. Yes, and it's anarchic. And it goes back to Ukrainian Cossacks, the runaway Serbs, which were running to what is now known as Zaporizhia region. It's in southern
Can you explain
Ukraine.
that? Can you explain that more?
Ukrainian Cossacks. Well, basically, these people were runaway Serbs, which were serving under feudalist system under the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the state which preceded basically Russian Empire in that region. They were running away, and they were freedom-liking, basically. Some of them were more like pirates. Some of them had hierarchy. There were different types of Cossacks, basically, in Ukraine. Some were official, registered, who served the Polish-Lithuanian state, and some were outlaws, basically. So many freedoms or freedom-liking mentality goes back to that. But also, something that many don't understand, that Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was one of the most free states in Europe at that time. I mean, 1500s and 1600s. Basically, aristocracy was sharing the so-called golden freedoms there. So basically, the king had no real rule over them. At the same time, the level of religious tolerance, well, until the period of Counter-Reformation, which started in there, let's say, early 1600s, Orthodox Jews and Catholics had a lot of freedom. So basically, it was based on the so-called Lithuanian statutes. There were 3 of them issued in 1500s. Lithuanian statutes were basically guaranteeing, it was not a constitution, but they were guaranteeing a lot of freedoms, basically unparalleled, let's say in Spain at that time, or even in France. It wasn't like that. It was maybe closer to Venetian Republic, maybe.
So you're saying Ukraine has a long history of being very pro-freedom.
Well, I would say not just pro-freedom in the modern sense, but there were more tolerance and less dependency on the absolute rulers. When Muscovy, at that time known as Muscovy, was completely formed by the Golden Horde at that time. It's a totally different division, starting with 1200s, when Russia basically and later Russian czars have inherited this tradition of Khans of great Khans of the Golden Horde, tradition of absolute control over their subjects. When in Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, kings were elected primarily. Starting with the end of Piast dynasty, they were elected. There was elected monarchy, basically. So it included a lot of process of selection. Of course, it wasn't like parliamentary republic as we know today in Poland, for example, but it was absolutely different from Muscovy at that time. Not even close to that. So also called liberals from, not liberals again in the modern sense, like Count Kurbsky under Ivan the Terrible in Moscow, ran away to Lithuania. All of them, like right now, they go to London, for example, to run away from Putin. At that time, they were running away to Lithuania. So Lithuania was the West, in that sense, the West, which was against the Russia at that time. And yes, so a lot of freedom is rooted in Polish-Lithuanian history, in Polish-Ukrainian history, which goes back to those golden freedoms and Lithuanian statutes.
Interesting. So to clarify, Lithuania is close to Ukraine?
At that time, it was much bigger. At that time, Lithuania included all of Belarus. Basically, it was all called Lithuania.
And Belarus is next to Ukraine.
Yeah. Can I pick up on a couple of things that Ilya and Oleksii have been talking about? Because I think you're raising some really, really important concepts for us to get our mind around what's going on in Ukraine now. So both of them, in different ways, were talking about what historically is a very deep-seated tension in Russian history between, we might say, Westernizers and Asiatics, or trying to figure out what the identity of the Russian nation is. Is it going to look westward, or is it going to tap into its authoritarian or Oriental kinds of traditions? And this gets played out in the time of Peter the Great. It gets played out with Catherine the Great, and as Oleksii was saying, even as far back as Ivan Grozny, Ivan the Terrible, right? And I think that that's really important to try and understand what's going on today, because my instinct was always with Putin to try and think about this in terms of realpolitik, right? So Ukraine is a buffer, had always been a buffer against invasions as far back as Sweden in the 1700s. And so it makes sense that you want to have a friendly regime there. And I guess Ilya was talking about Sevastopol and how important a port that was, not just for Putin. Catherine the Great, wanted a warm water port in Sevastopol, and not just a military port, but that was their trade port. And certainly at the end of World War II, if you look at the history of Yalta and Potsdam, it was clear that Stalin and the Soviet Union saw that they needed a, quote, sphere of influence on their Western border as a security matter. And if you try and look at it that way, then I think Ilya was exactly right, that you kind of scratch your head and say, why is Putin doing all this? Because he could achieve his objectives of having more compliant states and uniting Slavic peoples without this sort of brutal invasion. And I'm just left wondering if all that he says about the decadence and mendacity and treachery of the West is tapping into this deep historical tradition of not paranoia, but it is just sort of a moral evaluation that the West is duplicitous and it's bad for Russia. And he's sort of driven by, I don't want to say religious, but certainly not realpolitik in trying to evaluate why he should be confronting the West at this time. It's hard for me to rationalize or explain what he's doing without thinking through, why he is so persistent and adamant about, as I said, the decadence of the West. I mean, and he taps into this. He contrasts Russia with the West. In Russia, we know the difference between a boy and a girl. Like for him, that's an indicator that the path of Western liberalism is really degenerate. And I don't know if he's including himself or that's rationalization, but it's too frequent to ignore.
I believe that's a very good observation, and that's really his motive, because he believes, I think, and not without a reason, that a representative democracy is not a good governance model, which is, to some extent, totally valid point, and we've all seen this, right? But his take on conservative values just goes, to completely awkward side in the same way it went with Hitler, because Hitler's stance was pretty much the same. The West is decadent, it doesn't have strong moral values, and our national identity is stronger, and we should overcome this. All those statements by themselves, they're possible to discuss, but the means to the end, which they both chose, completely derails any possible moral advantage that this model might have.
I think, definitely he's tapped the internal divisions of the West. So the West itself is divided on, a new progressive agenda and traditionalism. The West itself is divided on what the route is to take. And definitely Putin has made great hay of that and portrayed Russia as, the defender of traditional values and the Orthodox religion and whatnot. But as to what Professor Harris was saying, I think that the history of Russia, and I'm going to have to be the standard critic of the American government here, because, Ilya can criticize the Russian government, much more familiar with that. I think America's NATO policy has been terribly counterproductive to its end goal. So in the 1990s, this is end of history era, right? The world lay prostrate to American ambition. It could have remade the world more or less in any way it wanted to. And several institutions, including NATO, which were made to originally contain Russia and were geared for combat, contain the USSR, could have been remade. As early as 1994, 1995, Yeltsin says to Clinton, please slow down NATO expansion. He specifically asked Clinton in 1995 to slow down NATO expansion so he's able to be elected in 1996, because Yeltsin was about to lose as Russia's economy is, going down the crapper. Putin gets elected, asks to become part of NATO, continues saying that he does not want NATO expansion. In 2007, he gives a speech saying that NATO expansion to its borders, which it had already been expanded to its borders, Poland joined NATO in 1999. In 2007, Putin says no more NATO expansion. In 2008, NATO says we're expanding, probably into Georgia and Ukraine. So there's a 30-year track record that the Russian people are not particularly happy with the idea that when the world could have been remade, when they were at their worst in the 90s suffering from economic hardship, that the United States took advantage of that to push its own foreign policy influence. And Ukraine sort of sadly falls in the middle of that because it's what people have had to march through to get to Russia, right? Napoleon marched through Ukraine, Hitler marched through Ukraine. So one of the questions I think that people should ask themselves, which I myself don't have an answer to, is sphere of influence theory, is that valid, right? How much weight can you put on that? Because the United States is the whole the United States is the whole what's the name?
Monroe. The
Huh?
Monroe Doctrine, you mean?
Like you can't.
What doctrine?
The Monroe Doctrine, essentially, that America is our sphere of influence, and European countries should not be meddling in the United States or around it. And this is something that more or less is an American truism, right? We get very upset whenever anybody's messing in the North American hemisphere. And so we buy into sphere of influence theory when it's based on our national interest. But when it's coming from Russia, it looks very weird to us. It's like we can understand our nationalism, but we can't understand other people's nationalism. Now, I think every single person has to make a decision whether or not they buy sphere of influence theory. And sadly, unfortunately, Ukraine, which is a nation with democratic rights and ability to choose its own future to join NATO, falls in the middle of this argument about grand strategy.
Yeah,
I think, I think that this partly comes from a very different understanding of power projection historically in the United States politics, which can be clearly seen in the documents such as Federalist Papers. It's all in there. Like United States politics didn't change since then, and Russia. And I think that although from Putin perspective, this distinction might make sense, but you probably know that both Yeltsin and Putin did not completely rule out that Russia eventually will join NATO.
right.
But somehow, around 2007, for some reason, Putin became very resentful because he thought maybe, or he perceived it like the West does not respect him enough, or the West does not respect Russia enough. And that's when all this anti-NATO discourse started ramping up. It wasn't the case before. Around 2000, around the year 2000, and especially in the middle of 90s, outlook towards NATO was very positive.
Right. Although, I think Nick was being too kind to the American government in his evaluation there. It wasn't
I'm
just
trying to moderate myself.
Yeah. So the other layer to this, beyond the the question of the eastward movement of NATO, was, and this ties in with what Nick was saying about this end of history perspective that we could remake the world, is the role the United States played in consulting or advising Russia about the transition to a market economy and the shock therapy that was overseen by Yegor Gaidar and others.
Can you explain that a little more? What shock therapy?
Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, so after the fall of the Soviet Union, there were a parade of American economists and business consultants. Jeffrey Sachs, who's at Columbia now, was a big player in this. And they were working with a number of Russian economists, academics, leaders. Yegor Gaidar was probably one of the most prominent among them. And the idea of shock therapy was you needed to quickly transition to free markets, and you needed to privatize a lot of what was economic activity in Russia. And it got to the level where I think there were Western loans to what are now oligarchs to finance their ability to buy controlling interest in major Russian enterprises like Rosneft, oil company, and
There was
others.
also a 10.2 or 10.4 billion dollar loan from the IMF in 1995.
Right, and that's important. In a sense, you know, what the IMF was doing in restructuring economies in the third world was the same playbook they were bringing to Russia, and it created, I think, quite a lot of resentment. And the economic performance of Russia in the 90s was left a lot to be desired. And I think that poor economic performance and the rise of these oligarchs, which we helped facilitate, actually wound up being helpful to Putin, both because it undermined the relationship with the West, and it allowed him to make common cause with these oligarchs. He made peace with them, and they supported his regime.
Okay. Yes, go ahead, Oleksii.
I would like to say that basically, just very quickly about NATO. You see, NATO actually doesn't really like to accept new members all the time. It's very difficult to become a member, actually. The reason why Poland, for example, Hungary, Baltic countries, of course, like Lithuania, became members of NATO because they knew that this is the only real protection at this point. One of the reasons why Baltic states were not invaded earlier on was because they are NATO. The reason why it happens right now in Ukraine, what happens is because we are not part of NATO. So basically, NATO is standing on the way of people like Putin to expand their imperial influences. So this is very, very quick note. And the second one is how to compare Russia right now. The best comparison in history is basically Germany after World War I, particularly 1920s, 1930s. As we know, well, Germany at that time was defeated and began to develop this huge complex of inferiority. And as the country at that time, which did not have a lot of experience with democracy, also Kaiser Germany, Imperial Germany, and suddenly the Weimar Republic. Of course, they had huge reparations to get paid. Russia was not forced. Something is with the internet. Is everything fine? Because I think internet was abrupted for a second.
Yeah, we lost you for a second there.
Yeah, it happens. So basically, 1920s in Germany are very close to 1990s in Russia, in post-Soviet Russia. Very first experience with democracy and capitalism after 70 years of communism. Sudden freedoms, sudden chaotic situation. And at that time, they began to develop this very similar legend to the German legend of that time, of the hit in the back or stab in the back by liberals, Democrats, Westerners, decadents, and so on and so forth. And people who began to lead this sort of reconquest of the Soviet, not Soviet without communism, but this Russian imperialistic ambition, were people from KGB. Former KGB, because former KGB was the only organization which basically survived under another name, but with the same people, with the same force, with a very strict organization and internal traditions. And of course, lots of information, because who wins? Who has information? So they were revanchists. Many of them were anti-Semitic under the Soviet time. So they played this role of so-called steel helmet in Germany, Stahlhelm, this organization which was extremely nationalistic in Germany in the 1920s, even before the Nazi Party came about. So basically, Putin himself also felt betrayed by liberals, by Gorbachev, by this horrific thing, which destroyed his KGB career and so on. So basically, what happens is Russians begin to long for this strong hand, strong leader who's going to be anti-Western, who is going to so-called reunite Russian nation and basically envy and destroy all the enemies. So this is very, very similar parallel. Even his speeches, when they have annexed Crimea in 2014, his speech was so similar by everything, in major postulates, so similar to Hitler's speech when they have annexed Sudetenland, that suddenly the German nation divided is united again, and so on and so forth. All these ideas, this notion is very, very similar in many ways. And eventually...
I have a couple questions for Oleksii.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Just a brief aside. Gorbachev ended up in a Pizza Hut commercial, out of all things.
Yes, he ended up, and that means the guy how not ambitious he was eventually, unlike Putin, for example, was. Gorbachev never fought for his power. Yes.
My questions for you were: you make the Hitler comparison. I've heard that comparison being made a lot, but also Hitler was even more popular in Austria than he was in Germany. Which, do you find a parallel to that with the annexation of Crimea? Because it's my understanding,
partially,
at least, that Crimea would have preferred to be part of Russia. Do you have the same understanding?
Well, you see, first they were, but people who come from there, and by the way, we should not forget the real people of Crimea who are original to that land. It's Crimean Tatars. Basically, that's the land of Crimean Tatars, and Crimean Tatars right now, we should never forget this, are going through absolutely horrible experience right now in Crimea. They're being arrested, accused.
Yeah, they're a minority in Crimea.
Yeah, and it's a very brutal history of Crimean Tatars in Crimea since Catherine II's annexation of Crimea, or Crimean Khanate at that time. Basically, most of them have escaped to Turkey. And of course, the most recent horrible was Stalin's resettlement of Crimean Tatars from Crimea. So basically, Crimean Russians were, yes, they felt betrayed as Austrians after the fall of Austrian Empire in Germany, feeling like, but even Hitler actually refused to annex Südtirol, Southern Tyrol, from Italy, because he believed it's his, what Austrian Germans lived, for example. So, and he was calling Italy and Mussolini his allies. Putin always says that Ukraine is a brotherly nation, quote unquote, but he agreed to annex Crimea from their brothers. It's like cutting your finger and then saying, okay, let's be friends now.
So do you believe that Crimea wanted to be part of Russia in 2014?
Russians, not all of them actually. Not all of them. First of all, again, there were not only Russians. Again, Crimean Tatars, Ukrainians, many Russians were just basically not very well motivated. They were, okay, you stuck us into Russia, okay, we will not resist. If we stay in Ukraine, okay, we will not resist. Typical Soviet mentality. Without really who commands us, we're going to do it. And the most motivated pro-Russian city there is Sebastopol, probably, with the military base. They were the most pro-Russian people, probably similar to residents of Linz in Austria when they were pro-Anschluss with Germany. But generally speaking, no, I wouldn't say they were extremely running for uniting with Russia, because Putin sent his military there to do it. He sent his green.
I think Oleksii's internet cut off again.
I
But
think
Nick,
there
do you
was
want to?
another internet abruption.
Yeah, we
Very
lost
quick
you for a
one.
second there.
So
Nick, do you want to
hear me?
ask your? Yeah, you're back, Oleksii. We can hear you,
Yeah,
although.
there's something with the
there it's
local
moving
internet.
again.
Yes.
Nick, do you want to
Is it-
ask your
I think it's
next
okay.
question?
Yeah, I think I sort of combined the questions. My point was that even in, I think, 1991, when Ukrainian independence was being proposed and voted on, Crimea, even at that time where there was elation about the Soviet Union falling apart and the Soviet republics getting their independence, Crimea only voted for independence with Ukraine by 53%. It's like a very slight margin. And that of course, over time, that goodwill went away as Crimea voted on it based on the fact it would be autonomous. It would have its own constitution, it would have its own president, and Ukraine sort of had to get rid of that in the 90s. So I know there are minorities in Crimea. For example, the Tatars, as you pointed out, are terribly treated.
Well,
in Crimea.
basically, with your question, internet was abrupting, so I have missed some of parts of your question.
Yeah, like I was saying,
So you said about referendum.
Yeah, my point was only that the original referendum for independence
No.
only succeeded with 53% in
So
Crimea.
basically, I think internet is abrupting again, and I have missed some parts of your question.
It's okay, we can move on.
I can cover for Oleksii here.
The Russians are destroying Oleksii's internet. They don't want him to speak.
So I think that pro-Russian sentiment in Crimea was basically like
no, internet is abrupting horribly right now, and it just breaks.
So it was 53% in when Soviet Union dissolved. I don't believe it was like significantly higher if we take genuine numbers during the referendum in 2014. But you know, the referendum which is conducted at the gunpoint is not really a referendum. You can't call it that. We can say for sure that pro-Russian sentiment in Crimea is relatively high. That much is true, absolutely. But factual numbers from that referendum make no sense because that is not how you conduct referendums. Even the ballot for this referendum was very similar to the one that Hitler had when Hitler annexed Austria. So we can't really rely on those numbers because the conditions under which those numbers were obtained absolutely preclude any honest polling opinion, so to speak.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Referendums should be done before the tanks roll in. Although I think there's a broader question here about sovereignty and the right to secede. Let's say that Crimea somehow managed to vote on seceding from the Ukraine before the tanks rolled in. Would that vote hold, right? I think there was a similar situation in Spain with the breakaway region. What was the region in Spain that was trying to break away? I'm drawing a blank. I've been up all night.
Catalonia. So
Yeah,
it's a difficult question. It's a difficult question because Ukraine, by its constitution, is a unitary state. So it does not technically allow its subjects to succeed by referendum. But if this sentiment was really high, there were certainly peaceful ways to resolve it. Just nobody went this way, and everything just went sideways.
Yes, it's very interesting to say that my friends from Sebastopol who ran away from there 8 years ago, they were describing me stories how they were sending ballots from Russia already signed that yes, we're pro-Russia, and basically where they were thrown into ballot boxes, and basically the situation was you cannot call it referendum at all. It's an Anschluss, like Germany and Austria in 1938, basically. That's the only best parallel you can, or Sudetenland, when it was taken away from Czechoslovakia and taken and basically became part of Nazi Germany. So that's what it is. Plus, it doesn't mean that all Russian ethnics in Crimea are happy right now. Many of them are not. For example, the latest reports show that many of the drafted soldiers, which are supposed to go to fight Ukraine right now from Crimea, refuse to get drafted. They just refuse to get drafted, especially those who are a bit older than 20 years old, and they absolutely don't want to fight Ukraine. And many people simply cannot speak their minds there, because you cannot, especially Crimean Tatars, who are probably the most freedom-liking people in that part of Ukraine. because they went through horrible experiences. They were deported by Stalin. They know how to fight very well, politically insist on their ideas. So they are the most dissident group in Crimea right now. So all the truth you get from Crimea, you usually get from them, from runaways from there, from their stories, and so basically the pretty brutal reality. So even Russian ethnics in Crimea right now, they are not happy as much as they were expecting it would be in Russia. Especially those who, as I said before, are complaining or saying something against just regular things, even apolitical things. Just let's say central heating is not working very well. If you complain too much without this comment from a top, in one way or another, if you are just having some self-organization, the self-organization will be squashed. So in Crimea, the situation is they are not happy really with being part of Russia right now. Many of them. This
is interesting to me because I have never thought of Putin as being similar to Hitler. Is there like an ethnic group or something that Putin is targeting? I thought that was kind of the main thing with Hitler. I mean, I see the kind of historical, like, we need to restore our pride, we need to take back what was lost. I see that aspect, but is there like a blaming a certain group thing going on?
I don't think there's an ethnicity aspect to this, but certainly the entire public strategy of both Hitler and Putin is built upon resentment, and that is the key point why what they're doing is so similar.
Okay.
In case of Hitler, the resentment was for the loss in World War I and what happened after Trianon Treaty, which was maybe completely unfair to Germany and sort of humiliated it. In case of Putin, it was resentment for dissolution of USSR. We have lost a great country. It's the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, and so on and so forth. So reasons are different, but resentment is the same. We lost a beautiful empire, and we must have it back. So that's that.
Okay, interesting. So looking forward then, what do you guys think? I mean, we're in a speculation, you know, we can't know what's going to happen, but just based on your understandings of the situation, do we have any speculation about what might happen if Ukraine gets taken over, if it doesn't? Any thoughts on that?
Well, of course, the scariest thing is it's similar to Poland after it was taken by Germany. You see, the thing is, it's hard to imagine. Well, we already know what happens in Crimea right now, and we know what happens in those separatist republics in Donbass and eastern Ukraine, where people can just disappear, for example, just disappear. And suddenly he speaks against something, and then you never know where that person is. That's how it goes. And of course, knowing that the pro-Ukrainian position of Odessa, of Kharkiv, especially right now after cluster bombs are falling on Kharkiv, well, of course, can you imagine if Russians try to occupy, I should say Putin's Russians, right, are going to occupy that, how horrible will be that. Refugees, people who will not accept that conquest and occupation. It will be absolutely unbelievable. Those who speak against that will be jailed and disappear. It's just going to be brutal occupation. Much worse than Crimean occupation, much worse than occupation of eastern parts of eastern Ukraine for the last 8 years. But from the stories I know of people who are running away from Crimea or running away from those regions of Donbass, you don't want this to happen, because it's going to be much worse, because there is much more resistance right now, even from the people you did not expect to resist. By the way, the newest news right now is the town of Zhytomyr, which is closer to the western Ukraine, is being bombarded right now, and the civilian building was destroyed. That's the newest information.
I think Ukrainian people will find literally to the last man standing.
Yes, I agree.
There's no way back for them, and they will do everything in their power to stop it.
Yes.
I don't think Ukraine will fall. I think it is going to.
Me too. Me too. Plus, we should not overestimate Russian potential. You see, they were bragging a lot all the time. But again, if they're sending tanks, T-72 tanks, 1960s, 70s technology, with 20-year-olds and with rations expired, it says 2015 on their rations right now. Can you imagine? You see, without GPS, they sometimes go in circles around the same region in the woods in northern Ukraine right now. You can tell that they were really, really bragging about their might all these years under Putin. Because everything is corrupt. We should understand that their army is unbelievably corrupt. These young soldiers who go to the army, they're being hazed by the second-year servants in the army, so-called Dedovshina, the grandfather's law, where conscripts are being hazed and tortured by the second-year soldiers, so-called grandfathers, quote unquote. So their army is really demoralized all the time by this. To serve in the Russian army is pretty brutal experience, if you know that.
Yeah,
So basically, building summer houses for their colonels and generals, doing construction work for their superiors instead of being trained all the time. You see, and huge corruption, billions of dollars of corruption inside the army. So basically, the reason why the Russian army is being held back for so long, something they did not expect, is of course our resistance, and the second is huge corruption and bragging they had in many ways.
Yeah. So Stacia, I think there's a couple of different levels on which we can talk about what happens next. And Oleksii and Ilya have a much firmer grip than I possibly could on the culture and capacity of the Russian army versus the Ukrainian resistance. So I'm not going to venture there. But another level you can look at this is what's likely to happen with respect to the West interacting with Russia. And that has me very, very, very worried. So, optimally, you could have some, outcome like the Cuban Missile Crisis, where there's behind-the-scenes negotiation, and there's some way to bring this to some kind of a resolution. But what I'm very worried about now is not just, leaders, but military spokesmen and pundits and journalists on the internet or on social media talking about the need for regime change in Russia and talking about the fact that we need to crush Putin now. It's all sounding to me a lot like Iraq, fight them there now instead of dealing with them later. And this sort of brinksmanship, particularly from journalists or armchair military folks, is really, really, really worrisome to me. I don't know. I see Craig smiling. Maybe you could weigh in at this point.
Sure. So thanks, Richard. You and I are probably going to diverge somewhat here. So given that I assume most of our audience is going to be American, I want to take a little bit of an American-centric approach to this, and that is that to walk back in the conversation a little bit, Americans really don't have any conception of what it's like to live with threatening neighbors on their borders. The European continent has a very, very different history than the American continent, and it's just so we can't fathom the kinds of things. One of the reasons that we misunderstand and fail to predict people like Putin and Hitler are partly because of this, and partly because we've never felt the huge national defeat like Ilya was talking about with Germany in the 1920s and Russia in the 1990s. And so I kind of want to talk from an American perspective this way, and bring the conversation to what America is more worried about, and then I'll bring it back to Ukraine, and I think that's China, because China also has a period that it calls its century of humiliation, which was 1850 to 1950, more or less, and they still preach this kind of this national motivation to regain previous power, going back to the Han Dynasty 2,000 years ago, plus the same kind of rhetoric that you heard from Hitler, the same kind of rhetoric that you hear from Putin in the last 10, 20 years. And my concern, I mean, America is very, very war weary after Iraq and Afghanistan. And I think what has happened, and part of Putin's calculations with Ukraine currently, is he sees this and he thinks that this is his best time to act for what he wants to do. And as Oleksii said earlier, it seems counterproductive to his goals. But maybe one of the factors is that, one of the things preventing him from doing it earlier, or one of the things that is making him more impatient now, or more eager now to do it the way he's doing it, is that he's testing America's resolve. Because despite America not having a huge interest national security wise in Ukraine and Western Russia, we are one of the only nations capable of unilaterally countering Russian military action. The top three militaries in the world right now are, on a national level, are Russia, China, and the US. And so this may be factoring into what Putin is doing. And my concern is not that we should intervene on a self-serving basis, because, to be blunt about it, it doesn't matter much to us what happens to Ukraine. It does in a longer perspective, larger geopolitics, NATO, Russia, thing, but it's not going to immediately impact American security. But what China could do will. And the reason I'm connecting these two things is because if Russia's testing American resolve now and we don't rise to that challenge, I think China is certainly going to capitalize on that and learn the lesson that, okay, the US is not interested in defending, my small neighbors from us, whether it's Ukraine from Russia or something like Taiwan from China. And that's a pretty good estimation that we don't have the will to do that. And just like Russia has claims to, historical claims going back centuries to Ukraine and other countries in the region, China has claims that it has been asserting pretty aggressively for the last 20 years or so over its smaller neighbors. I mean, part of this goes back to the Cold War with Vietnam and Korea, but as recently as 2 years ago and a little bit of change, we all seem to have forgotten about Hong Kong. China is doing this.
That's what I was going to say. I was going to say, did we not show a lack of resolve regarding Hong Kong already?
We did show a lack of resolve, just like we showed a lack of resolve with Crimea in 2014. We can do all the sanctions we like, and we should. But once someone takes, invades the sovereign borders of another nation and controls it, that is a military action, and it needs a military response. And that gives me no pleasure, because I'm tired of war as well. But if we don't rise to the challenge of, and I think there's an ethic here, because we're getting bogged down into specifics, and there's all this history that I certainly understand probably the least of everyone here. But on a moral basis, how we answer this says a lot about who we are as America. And the conclusion I've come to recently is that we need to stick to the moral of defending the weak against the strong, particularly when the weaker nation is a democracy and some freedom-loving people versus a totalitarian regime the likes of Russia and China. And again, this is kind of a unique position because it's the US, Russia, and China that are the most powerful militaries in the world. And the fourth place is, I think, India, and it's far, far, far away from the third. And so that is my basis for us, arguing that we should intervene militarily, hopefully with allies. But I mean, I don't know that Ukraine has a lot of time to get a coalition together. I certainly hope they do, but I think it's a mistake to underestimate Russia in this regard.
Yes, of course. I would say that their army was sometimes overestimated or underestimated. It's not as strong as many believe for certain reasons, as I said before. But of course, it should not be underestimated because it was underestimated and Putin was underestimated. How worse he gets every year. Again, some people were not believing the reports. Okay, he's just bragging, he's scaring everyone, but he's not going to go so insane. And right now, I think maybe he's a bit over the border. For the last 2 years, reportedly, he's living in a bunker. He doesn't want COVID. He's afraid of everyone. And if you've seen these latest meetings with French President Macron and his chiefs of general staff, he sits behind this long table. This is unbelievable how afraid he is of everyone. So basically, he gets worse. He gets worse, and his play is absolutely unbelievable. So right now, what he is doing, that's the crossing the border completely. This is not normal for a normal person to do. This is as simple. Of course, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, even 8 years ago, it was possible to say that, well, he's not insane. He's just calculating. He's just doing this, doing that. Right now, this is madness, what we see. This is madness. When children's hospitals are purposely targeted in Ukraine by Russians, and of course, again, even people who are, let's say, pro-Russian leaning are picking up rifles, saying we're going to defend Ukraine, because what is going on is unbelievable. This is just something absolutely, even for these last 6 days, it's kind of like you still have to co-op with the reality. And as the new Chancellor of Germany, Scholz, when he went before Bundestag, the German Congress, he had some nice words to say. He said that the world is different right now. After February 24th, Germany, Poland, Europe, US, it's different. After what happened, it's not going to be the way it was. And he said that they're going to build liquid gas factories, cogeneration plants to diverse the German access to natural gas. There is a huge shift in German foreign policy right now. When you have almost 200,000 Germans in the Tiergarten area in Berlin demonstrating in support of Ukraine, this is something I did not expect in Germany right now. There is a huge shift in this situation. Just in a matter of days, the logic of understanding Putin 10 years ago is completely different right now. It's not the same logic anymore. We're dealing with the madness because this is unbelievable.
In addition to that, I would say that it's not only about American resolve per se, because what I'm sure of, if Ukraine doesn't get help, Putin won't stop there.
Yes, absolutely.
He'll press on. That's for sure, because that's how he sees the world, as a zero-sum game, and he'll continue to play that game and pressure others, and probably will try to invade NATO allies and test the American resolve there. So he will continue to up the game the way he wants, and stopping him right now in here is absolutely essential for core American interests. That's what I would say. Just like the situation is remarkably similar to Hitler's attack on Poland, which is how World War II began.
So
nobody wants nuclear war, of course, but if we have to choose between sort of bad and even worse, and this is the choice we have.
So let me push back a little bit on the analysis here. So instead of making an analogy to Sudetenland or Poland, might even be better, because Hitler invented the story that they had to preemptively attack Poland to protect Germany, which sounds a lot like Putin now. But what if we make an analogy with Hungary in 1956 or Czechoslovakia in 1968? So by Craig's logic, those were military actions that required a military response. But we sort of looked at the strategic alignment of forces, and there might have been military responses by redeploying or putting pressure on Russia. Why is this different than Hungary or Czechoslovakia? And why wouldn't building an alliance and taking a much longer view of containment and pressure and economic warfare, why would that not be appropriate in this case?
I think I have an answer to that. The difference is leadership mentality, and Soviet Union, no matter how cruel and murderous it was a system with its own sorts of checks and balances. So there was a party. The party had sort of codex and sort of code of honor and ideology. Mm-hmm. And KGB was party's tool. KGB never acted on its own. So it was reporting to the party, and it did party's bidding. And party had sort of way of moral standards, of some very weird sort, of course, but still there was some framework, some moral framework they were operating in. And now, when the leadership is entirely comprised of KGB operatives, which have no moral standing whatsoever, it's totally different. So they have absolutely no checks on them. They act within their sort of paranoid USSR-style vision of the West, but there is no party leader above them who can tell them, so, okay, guys, we don't want to destroy the world, you have to stop right there. So it just goes unhinged, and, sort of resonance that it creates, it keeps increasing and increasing and increasing, and situation gradually, since the year 2000 when Putin was elected, the situation gradually becomes more and more unhinged and dangerous for everyone. It won't stop. It won't stop there.
And I have a different answer for Richard to this question, and that is, I don't know the history behind, I believe you said Hungary and Czechoslovakia in the 50s and 60s. So I'm not even going to opine there. Like I say, I'm getting at the principle. And in my opinion, if we take a slow approach and form some other coalition that isn't NATO, or that NATO is only a part of, to reverse the action that Russia is doing now, how long does that take? A year, 2 years? I don't know, but I know
it could take a very long time.
Right. So my concern is China. If we don't show a quick and decisive response, but we show a more slow, measured response, well, if China invades Taiwan tomorrow, that's a much harder thing to walk back than Russia invading Ukraine. It's just the geography of the situation, and the military forces involved are going to be much, much harder for anyone to counter, because there's no military alliance sitting over there next to Taiwan to help. Mm-hmm. And something that has been rattling around my brain in this vicinity as well is China is much more ascendant than Russia. We've been just dumping obscene amount of money into China, and that's not going to stop anytime soon, no matter what happens. We're simply too intertwined with them to do that. But in the hypothetical scenario where China invades Taiwan, and then America, wants to do something about it, military or otherwise, China's going to go, well, you guys didn't do anything about Ukraine. So obviously this isn't about, protecting smaller countries from bigger nations. So why are you over here? It's just your own self-interest. And that would be to a great deal correct, because we just want to save Taiwan, because Taiwan is much more important for us economically than Ukraine is. And that's going to make it harder for the American people to get behind defending Taiwan. Because as we've seen from Afghanistan, the American people tend to not support wars that don't have a good ethical foundation. Like Desert Storm protecting Kuwait against Iraq was wildly popular. Going into Afghanistan was wildly popular because we were, reacting in retaliation and self-defense. Staying in Afghanistan 20 years after that was wildly unpopular for this reason. It didn't have a good moral basis other than like trying to impose democracy where it wasn't going to work, and a bunch of things that are harder to sell people on. So that's my concern, basically, that Taiwan is a harder fight. China has been itching for it and very clear about it for decades, just as Putin has been. And the American people are going to be less likely to support helping Taiwan and any of the other, nations that China has plans for if we don't help Ukraine.
Yeah, I have a few comments on this. Going back to Ilya, I think Ilya made a very interesting point about the moral framework of the Soviet Union and whatnot, and the moral framework of Putin. I just thought that point was interesting. But since we're making predictions, sadly, I think that Ukraine will likely be defeated or end up in a severely diminished state. I don't think that Russia's throwing everything it can at it. Like you mentioned, they're getting rid of a lot of old Soviet-era material, not the modern stuff. Either way, it's going to be partitioned, and either some sort of deal is going to be reached with the current government, or that current government will be overthrown. NATO will not intervene. Poland will not intervene. And then Russia will be left with a bleeding ulcer, which is an insurgency, because I do very much agree that Ukrainians will keep fighting. About that point. About Putin's longevity, right, whether he's going to last. This is very hard to tell, because who knows what's going on inside the Kremlin? Who knows what sort of loose coalition of oligarchs and interests right now are backing Putin or running away from him? And there's really no way to know. So, for example, in 2012, I thought Assad was on his way out. Yet here we are, almost 10 years later, and he's still hanging on somehow. So I think Putin has made a decision that the West does not want to deal with him. It became very clear to him that nothing he will ever do will get the United States to in any way agree that he has any sort of legitimacy. And so not viewing a way out through diplomacy, he sort of settled on this, which, as Ilya said earlier, while quoting Talleyrand, it's worse than a crime. It's a mistake. It's a blunder. Could very well be. That's for history to prove. And the last thing, which Craig mentioned about testing the resolve of America and whatnot, which is an interesting argument. I think that the United States has been terribly unfair to Ukraine for many, many years. In fact, the United States made certain promises. NATO has been making promises to the Ukraine that it's going to become a member for many, many years. And now when it's finally time to do something, essentially they're hung out to dry. However, I don't think it is wise to go into a land war with Russia. It's a nuclear power after all, right? Like on one side, we just spent an hour saying how Putin is insane and he's sitting across long tables and he's got no moral agency and he's a madman. And at the same time, we're saying that it's going to be okay to step up to a nuclear power. Part of the reasoning behind nuclear power is that two great powers can no longer engage in warfare, only through proxies.
I want to respond to that very briefly.
Yeah, one second, yeah. And so I think that's going to be difficult. That's something you don't want to gamble with nuclear warfare, right? Like I'm not willing to stake my life on it. I'm not willing to stake my life or anyone's life on the fact that he wouldn't use tactical nuclear strikes, particularly when Russia doesn't have a no first strike pledge. Russia can and might, who knows? But the second point is to Craig and China. It would be maybe perhaps a strategic mistake to get bogged down in China. I mean, to get bogged down in Ukraine when U.S. policy, according to you, should be facing toward China, right? To get bogged down in this one location and increase military spending here and get into, I don't know, a protracted land war against Russia when we should be looking for Chinese containment, according to you, I think might be a strategic mistake.
Yeah, so a couple of things. I think it's a mistake to. I mean, Nick has kind of said that we've been calling Putin crazy. I've specifically not done that. I don't think he is. Just like I don't think Xi Jinping is crazy. That's part of the reason I tried to explain the American-centric view and our inability to understand certain things. There's a long-standing national, cultural, possibly racial history and pride that we simply don't have in America that is motivating a lot of this, which since we don't have it, we mirror our thinking onto them and then think that would be crazy for us to do, which it would be because we don't have these long-standing histories that are really motivating. I do agree that it would be a really bad idea to get involved in a land war against Russia. I'm not, like I say, I'm making the moral argument, not the practical one, because failing the moral test makes the practical problems harder later. Yes, we're nuclear powers, but so is China, and if we're not going to go to war with or anything kinetic beneath the level of war against a nuclear power, well then China definitely has carte blanche to do what it wants. There are no good options, but I think I just see a very clear line between leaving Ukraine to its fate will be seen by China, who is much more powerful and I think willing than Russia to take its smaller neighbors that it's had designs on since the beginning. The very beginning of the communist regime over there was the fleeing of their defeated enemy to Taiwan, and China has never acknowledged that Taiwan is separate from them. They consider them a rogue state within the Chinese nation. So, I mean, it looks very similar to Putin's arguments, except even stronger and even more, yeah, so that's my response to that. There are no good options. I just think that failing this challenge or failing to defend Ukraine makes all of the cascading things, which I think are close to inevitable, even harder.
I would say that saying that Ukraine will be defeated is not very nice right now, even to me, and can be said by someone who doesn't really understand the situation. You see, Nick, you have never been to Ukraine, right? Never lived there. Neither Russia, Belarus, Poland. So you see, when you don't understand this, don't make these comments, okay? I will just give you this suggestion. If you don't understand the area very well, including military history or military situation on the field right now, and history of all these wars, I wouldn't give these comments, okay? Just go there, live there for a few years, and then make comments. Okay.
Does anyone else have anything to add? Okay. On that note, let's wrap up. Thank you all for joining in this discussion at this point in history that we're living through together. Thank you so much to our guests for joining. Please. Thank you. Please go to 2ndlook.news and subscribe for more in-depth articles. Be sure to hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel. Hit the notification bell so you get notified when we have new roundtables coming out. Stay tuned.